As you know, on the 7th of this month, the 7th of October 2023, Hamas terrorists from Gaza broke through the defence wall between them and Israel, and they invaded Israel. They killed around 1,400 innocent Israeli civilians. They wounded several thousand. They tortured some, raped some, and they took over 200 hostages. Prior to that, there were 4 major invasions by anti-Israel Muslim nations from around Israel after she was declared to be a nation in 1948. The pertinent question is, these nations of course attacked Israel. Israel didn't attack them. And so the pertinent question is, and it's the question I want to ask tonight, why? Why is this? What is the underlying reason for these invasions of Israel and this anti-Israel attitude? Well, putting it simply and concisely in one word, the answer is land. It really has to do with land. Palestinians and pro-Palestinians claim that the land occupied by Israel belongs to Palestinians and that Israel has stolen it off them. So the invasions have been an attempt to destroy the state of Israel and to seize the land and to make a Palestinian state. So the question is, whose land is it really? Who has legitimate claim to it? The Arabs or the Israelis? And in order to answer this question, we really need to go back into the history of the land, and to do that, we go back into biblical history because it contains the oldest and the most authentic history of the land. We call the land of Israel. That is why the land is called sometimes the land of the book being the Bible, because the Bible has the most authentic and the most comprehensive history of that land right up until the time of the New Testament. And this Bible history is confirmed and authenticated by secular historians and also by archaeology. Moreover, Muhammad himself and his Muslim followers respected these scriptures, and a lot of what they taught is actually drawn from these scriptures. Now, the biblical history of this land starts way back in the Old Testament, in Genesis, the first book of the Bible, from about chapter 12 on. We're going back 2000 BC, about over 4,000 years from our own time. And we're told that Abraham lived in a city called Ur in Mesopotamia. That's in the country of Iraq today. And we read there that he was led by God into the land that was known in those days as Canaan, due to being occupied by the Canaanites, who were descendants of Noah's son Ham, who were the ancestors of the Egyptians. Among these Canaanites was also a branch of the Canaanites called the Philistines, whose land, the name Palestine is actually, or Philistine is derived from that name. And it was a coastal territory known as the Gaza Strip today. Well, these Canaanites, they were steeped in idolatry. They were very immoral and very distasteful to God. So he promised to Abraham and his descendants that this Canaanites' land would be given to them, because he wanted to create a special holy nation for himself, and he wanted this land to be their homeland. And it was God's prerogative to do that. After all, he owned it. The earth is his and the fullness thereof. He can give whatever land he likes to whoever he likes. Now, the descendants of Abraham to whom this land was divinely bequeathed were, of course, the Israelites. And that is where the history of the land ownership actually begins. This is the history really of the whole history of the land in relation to Israel. It's the basis, it's the foundation of Israel's claim to ownership of the land. So if it could be proved that the biblical reference to Abraham here living in the land of Ur was unhistorical, it's just a myth, just a figment of the Bible's imagination, well then that would destroy the foundation of Israel's claim to the land, wouldn't it? And this is what some have tried to do in the past. They've claimed there was no such place as Ur, because they could find no reference to it in secular history. So they concluded the whole story about Abraham and the promises to him was just a myth not to be taken seriously. But in 1854, clay cylinders were found by archaeologists on an ancient Mesopotamian ziggurat, that's a temple tower in southern Iraq, covered with this ancient cuneiform writing, which actually stated the name of the place where it was found, and the name of the place was Ur. And since then, archaeologists have found more references in other places to Ur on various items. And such discoveries, of course, give credence to the story of Abraham. So then God promised Abraham that the land would become the homeland of his descendants. Now, due to Abraham's wife Sarah being barren, it was decided to have a son by proxy through an Egyptian servant girl that they had, whose name was Hagar. And she gave birth to the son, and his name was called Ishmael. And Ishmael became the ancestor of many Arab tribes. And for that reason, they claim that the land promises given to Abraham belonged to them, because Abraham was promised that he and his descendants would inherit the land. They say Ishmael was Abraham's firstborn son, so the land belongs to them. But there's more to the story, of course, which is conveniently overlooked and twisted rather badly, because the Genesis narrative goes on to say that Abraham's wife Sarah ended up having a son herself, and his name, of course, became Isaac, and he was the ancestor of the Israelites. And God made it clear that Isaac's descendants were the ones to inherit the land, not Ishmael's. And this made Ishmael jealous, resulting in a bad attitude towards Isaac. He became provocative. The Bible says he persecuted Isaac. He wanted the land himself. He didn't want Isaac to be the heir and to inherit the land. And this turned out actually to be a sign of future hatred and animosity of Arabs against Israel. Genesis 16 verse 12 says, the angel told Hagar her child, that is Ishmael, would be a wild ass of a man. His hand will be against every man, and every man's hand will be against him. And he certainly displayed this quite early in his life by his attitude towards Isaac. Ishmael's antagonistic behaviour resulted in it being perceived how incompatible he would be with Isaac, and what a mistake it would be for the two of them to inherit the land and share it together. It would clearly lead to conflict and division. So Ishmael was, through divine instruction, expelled from the promised land. And had his descendants obeyed God's instruction, they would not have moved in and tried to take over, and they could have avoided all the conflict and division and wars that have taken place since. However, it must be said, Abraham did love his son Ishmael, and it did grieve him to send him away out of the promised land. But God told Abraham that Ishmael would be blessed and that he would become a great nation. And we do read that he had 12 sons, and they occupied the land east of the promised land as far as Arabia. And they ended up with territory much, much larger than the promised land, and one that was rich in oil deposits and has brought great wealth to those Arab nations. Isaac's son Jacob also had 12 sons who became, as we know, the 12 tribes of Israel. And due to famine, they went to Egypt for relief, and they ended up staying there for several centuries, as God told Abraham they would, as we read in Genesis chapter 15. During this period, the Canaanites and the Philistines continued to occupy the promised land, and the Ishmaelites remained in the lands to the east where they had been sent. They didn't try to move back into the promised land while Israel was out of it down in Egypt. They respected God's instruction to Abraham. This brings us to Moses. In fulfillment of what God told Abraham in Genesis chapter 15, Moses led Israel out of Egypt up to the promised land. It should be noted that God told Moses to lead the Israelites, not the Ishmaelites, into the land. And on the way, as we know, the Red Sea was divided, enabling them to cross over to the other side, and they had an encounter with God at Mount Sinai. And the question is, can we really believe this? Yes, we can, because it's now known that the Red Sea they crossed was in fact the Gulf of Aqaba, and the departure point was from a place called Nuweiba. Arabia was on the other side, which is not surprising because the Bible tells us Mount Sinai was in Arabia. Galatians 4 verse 25. We know this is all true because at Nuweiba there is an ancient Phoenician column which is inscribed with ancient Hebrew writing set up by Solomon, king of Israel, commemorating the crossing. Solomon's name is inscribed there amongst the writing on that column. There was also an identical column on the opposite side, on the Arabian side. But when the Arabian authorities were notified about it, they removed it. Surprise, surprise. Also, the seabed where Israel crossed has been explored, and coral encrusted Egyptian chariot wheels and axles have been found, confirming the record in Exodus that the sea came crashing down on Egypt's armies and destroyed them as they were pursuing Israel. Explorers have also located Mount Sinai. It's the highest mountain in the region, in that region in Arabia, and the top section of it is burnt black. There's quite a few mountains through there, and it's the only one that's got the top of it has been burnt black. And this, of course, confirms Exodus 19 verse 18, which says God descended upon the mountain in fire, and it says it caused it to smoke. The remains of a stone altar found at the base of the mountain confirms Exodus 24 verse 4, which says Moses actually built the altar there at the base of the mountain. Another pile of stones with engravings of Egyptian bulls confirms the reference in Exodus 32, which says that the Israelites set up an altar and made and worshipped a bull calf when they thought that Moses wasn't going to come back from the mountain. While Moses was at Sinai, God gave Israel laws, not just moral and ceremonial laws, but also hygiene, sanitation, and quarantine laws. These laws all had to do with avoiding the spread of harmful bacteria and the sicknesses and the diseases that they cause. At the time, these laws were absolutely revolutionary. Nobody knew about bacteria, so these laws were not practiced by any of the nations on the planet. As Psalm 147 verse 19 to 20 says, God revealed his word to Israel. He has not done so to any other nation. 3,000 years after Moses, the microscope was invented. Bacteria was discovered, revealing how necessary and important these laws that God gave concerning hygiene and sanitation, quarantine and that were. They proved to be absolutely 100% scientific. It is clear, very clear, that the person at Mount Sinai who gave these laws to Israel knew all about bacteriology. That person was God, the God of Israel. And it confirms the record that he was leading the Israelites, not the Ishmaelites, into the promised land. Joshua finally led the Israelites into the land. And there were no Ishmaelites there when he went in, only Canaanites. Jericho was the first city that he conquered, and archaeologists have seen evidence of that. Joshua chapter 8 says Joshua built a stone altar at Mount Ebal near Shechem, and the remains of that altar have been discovered. It's still there today. You can see it if you're visiting Israel. The promised land, as we know, was divided up into 12 territories, including the area called the West Bank today. That was very much part and parcel of the land promised to Israel by God. And during the reign of King David, we're talking here about 1000 BC, he made Jerusalem Israel's capital city, which it remained for 1000 years. His son Solomon built the temple on Mount Moriah, where 2 Muslim mosques sit today. Remnants of Solomon's temple have actually been discovered by the archaeologists. Much later down in history, into New Testament times, Herod rebuilt the temple, and 10,000 Herodian stones are still in place around the 4 walls of that Temple Mount. You know, it would be the height of ignorance and of dishonesty to deny Israel's connection with that Temple Mount. But you know, many Muslim nations and United Nations organisation have tried to do that. They've tried to deny Israel's connection with that Temple Mount. Well, Israel occupied the land for around 1,500 years. Everywhere you dig in Israel, you find archaeological evidence of Israelite occupation during that period, but not Ishmaelite occupation. Zero evidence of Ishmaelite occupation of the land during that time. Ishmael's descendants are referred to in Judges 7 verse 12 as the children of the East. And on several occasions in Old Testament times, they tried to invade Israel, but they were driven back. Up until the Romans expelled the Jews from their land, Arabs never ever claimed that it belonged to them. In spite of all these facts, some do still dispute Israel's past occupation, which is not surprising when you remember some even try to deny the Holocaust. You know, there is a saying, there are none so blind as those who say they can see. For those who think there's no physical evidence for Israel's past occupation, I want you to consider the following archaeological evidence which I researched some time ago. I put it into a booklet. The booklet is entitled Palestine, Whose Land? Jerusalem, Whose City? Israel or Islam. So it's actually on our church website, www.bibletruthrestored.org, and anybody who wants to can download that. I want to read to you what I actually put in this book in relation to this evidence. Firstly, the victory stele of Pharaoh Meneptah, discovered in 1896 at Thebes, now housed in the Egyptian Museum at Cairo. It gives an account of Meneptah's victories and includes a victory in Canaan over Israel. It reads, Israel is devastated. This is proof positive Israel was living in Canaan by at least the 13th century BC, when Meneptah, the son of Ramses the Great, reigned over Egypt. 2. In 1994, a stone slab was found on a mound in Israel known as Tel Dan. Tel means mound. An inscription was found on the stone which read, quote, the house of David, and also, quote, the king of Israel. It was written in the Hebrew script of the 9th century BC, The inscription confirmed that Israel existed in the land and that David was king and had a dynasty, that is, house. 3. Pharaoh Shishak's victory relief on a temple wall at Thebes also confirms Israel's occupation of Canaan. Shishak reigned from 940 to 915 BC, and his relief records how he invaded Israel, plundered treasure from the temple at Jerusalem, previously built by Solomon, and took captives from the cities of Israel. 156 of Israel's towns and localities are named on the relief, again confirming Israel's occupation of the land at that time. 4. The Moabite stone, discovered in 1868 at Dibon in Jordan and now in the Louvre Museum, Paris, is inscribed with a record of the rebellion of Mesha, the king of Moab, against the king of Israel. This occurred around 850 BC. It's referred to in the Bible in 2 Kings chapter 3. Reference on the stone to the king of Israel confirms Bible history concerning Israel's occupation of the land under a king. 5. The black obelisk, commissioned by the ancient Assyrian king Shalmaneser III, was discovered in Nimrud, Iraq, in 1846. It's inscribed with many scenes and inscriptions commemorating the victories and deeds of the king who reigned 858 to 824 BC and is on display at the British Museum. One of the scenes on the obelisk refers to Israel in her land, which he invaded, and mentions the king of Israel, Jehu. Not only that, but there is actually a carving on one of the panels depicting Jehu on his knees offering tribute to the king of Assyria. This confirms references in the Bible to both Shalmaneser and Jehu, king of Israel. 6. Sennacherib's prison. This six-sided hexagonal prism was unearthed in 1830 at the ancient Assyrian capital of Nineveh, situated in Iraq today and is now in the British Museum. It records the triumphs of the Assyrian king Sennacherib, who reigned around 700 BC. On the prism, he refers to the Jews in the land of Canaan and mentions their king, Hezekiah, by name. This confirms the references in the Bible to Sennacherib and to Israel occupying the land with a king by the name of Hezekiah reigning from Jerusalem. 7. References made in the Bible to King Hezekiah, who in the 8th century BC, due to the threat of Assyrian invasion and siege by Sennacherib, commissioned the digging of a tunnel to divert water from a lower pool outside the city to a pool inside the city. Towards the end of the tunnel, an inscription was found on the wall in 1880 describing the carving of the tunnel. This also confirmed another part of Bible history concerning Israel during her occupation of the land. Unfortunately, someone cut the inscription out of the wall. It ended up in a Turkish museum in Istanbul, but can be seen there. 8. Added to this evidence could be numerous tablets, coins, and seals bearing the names of Jewish kings who reigned at Jerusalem, along with other Israelites who lived in the land, who are referred to in the Bible by name. Not to mention the Dead Sea Scrolls, which authenticate the Hebrew Scriptures, but to do so would be too time-consuming. Now, when the Romans destroyed the city of Jerusalem and the temple and exiled the Jews, they discarded the name Jerusalem and they replaced it with a Roman name. They also discarded the land name of Israel and called it Palestine in order to erase all connections with the Jews. Now, prior to the Romans doing this, Jesus prophesied that the Jews would be exiled among the nations and that Jerusalem would be trodden down, that is, occupied by force by the Gentiles, that is, by non-Jewish nations, until until the times of the Gentiles be fulfilled. Luke 21 verse 24. That word until indicates there would be a limit to the time that the Jews would be exiled and that Jerusalem would be occupied and controlled by non-Jewish nations. The implication of that word until is that the Jews would be regathered to their land and that Jerusalem would ultimately be restored to Jewish control. Time has proved Jesus' prophecy to be true. Since the Romans exiled the Jews, Jerusalem and the land has been occupied and controlled by numerous Gentile nations. The Holy Roman Empire, the Persians, the Crusaders, the Mohammedans, the Ottoman Turks, the Arabs, and even the British. But in 1967, Israel regained possession of the city and of the land. Now in 691 AD, the Mohammedans built the Golden Dome Mosque on Mount Moriah, where Israel's temple used to stand. The mosque was actually built over a large rock from which it was claimed Muhammad ascended to heaven. But there's no reference to this in the Quran, and in fact there's not a single reference to Jerusalem in the Quran. But there are over 600 references to Jerusalem in the Jewish scriptures. However, building a Muslim mosque in Jerusalem helped significantly to solidify attachment of Jerusalem to the Muslim faith. It was almost like saying, this is our land now. But you know, putting a Muslim mosque in Israel doesn't make the land of Israel become the Muslims' land. I mean, any more than if you were to put a Church of England in Arabia doesn't make Arabia belong to England. Quite foolish for anybody to think that by having a mosque there, that means that the Muslims own the land. Muhammad's favourite wife, Aisha, insisted Muhammad simply had a dream about travelling to Jerusalem and that it was not a physical journey at all. So why do Muslims want to believe that he literally and physically ascended to heaven from Jerusalem? Could it be, or could it have something to do with the fact that Jesus ascended to heaven from Jerusalem? I'll say a little bit more about that in a moment. It's natural to wonder why the Muslims built their mosque on the very same site where Israel's temple used to be. I mean, it's not like there weren't any other sites. There were plenty of other places they could have put it. It's not difficult to believe that the reason was to rival and to replace Israel's religion, not just because they believe Muhammad ascended from there. From the time of Muhammad, Islam really has been a Me Too, that is, copycat religion, attempting to ride on the coattails of other religions, particularly the Jewish religion. According to the historians, prior to Muhammad being converted and starting his new religion, his fellow Arabs were polytheists at the time. That is, they worshipped many gods. In fact, they had a different one for every day. Now, Muhammad claimed to be a descendant of Ishmael, of course, the son of Abraham, who was a strict monotheist. Ishmael's descendants in Muhammad's day had become polytheists. The Jews, however, descendants of Isaac, were anti-idolatry. They were strictly monotheists and were evidently more affluent than the Arabs at that time. It seems that they were more blessed by their monotheistic God than were the Arabs, who worshipped many gods. From ancient times, large numbers of Jews lived in Arabia. Some resided in Mecca. In Medina, there were 3 large tribes of Jews, had their synagogues and their scriptures there. And due to the fact that Muhammad, after his conversion, affirmed that the Jewish scriptures were true and that many statements in the Quran come from those scriptures, indicates Muhammad would have been influenced by those Jewish scriptures. That is, influence towards monotheism, the believing in one God. The name of the Jewish God, of course, was Yahweh, and the name of the God that Muhammad had was Allah. The heart of the Muhammad's religion is that there is no God but Allah, the one true God. And this is almost word for word the heart of the Jewish religion, which is there's no God but Yahweh, the one and only true God. Now, there was no other religion in the world besides Judaism that vigorously affirmed the strictly monotheistic concept of God and physical resurrection. And Muhammad was clearly influenced by that. It was also clearly as a result of the Jewish practice to face Jerusalem when you pray that Muhammad and his early followers did the same. Muhammad also in the early days observed the Jewish holy day of atonement. Muhammad was eager to win the allegiance and the support of the Jews, to whom, of course, he was very closely related. The problem was that Muhammad came to believe that he was a special prophet sent by God, and that he was actually predicted. He was prophesied in the Jewish scriptures. The problem was the scriptures that he quoted were misinterpreted and misapplied. He also failed to prophesy future events like the prophets did in the Jewish scriptures. He was a man claiming to be a prophet who never prophesied. That's a bit odd. And so the Jews rejected his claims and they stood aloof from him. He accused them of misinterpreting their own scriptures. And as a result, he withdrew from them. He abandoned the Jewish connections and he established a new independent religious and political system influenced to a large degree by those parts of the Jewish scriptures which suited his cause. He eventually raised an army, resorted to the sword to enforce his cause, attacking and massacring even Jews and even his own people who opposed him and who refused to submit to him. People were even forced at the point of a sword to embrace his religion. But in spite of Muhammad abandoning Jewish connections, his new religion resembled and reflected, sort of imitated, some of the religious practices of the Jews. And this gives the impression of him wanting what the Jews had, but with his own spin, with his own label, with his own brand on it. And if so, one cannot help but reflect back to the time when Muhammad's ancestor Ishmael was jealous of Isaac and wanted what he had and wanted to replace him and got nasty because he couldn't. In a strange sort of a way, it seems Muhammad was repeating history, trying to supplant what God gave to Israel. I'd now like to give some examples of how Islam has imitated aspects of the Jewish religion in an attempt to replace it. I've drawn up a list here and I'll just quickly take you through it. Some of them I've already briefly mentioned. 1. The primary statement in the Jewish creed given by God over 2,000 years before Muhammad states, "Hear, O Israel, Yahweh our God is one Lord." The primary statement in the Islamic creed similarly states, "There is no God but Allah." 2. God promised Isaac and his descendants, that's Israel, possession of the Holy Land and expelled Ishmael. Israel occupied the land over a period of around 1,500 years, and archaeological evidence proves this. But due to sin, God caused the Jews to be exiled, but did promise to regather them and establish them as a nation again. But during their exile, the Muslims moved in with their Me Too attitude and claimed possession of the land. 3. The Jews were told to face Jerusalem when they prayed. Muhammad initially imitated this, but later reversed the direction by telling the Arabs to face Mecca when they pray. 4. God told Israel to make pilgrimages to Jerusalem. Muhammad told Muslims to make pilgrimages to Mecca. 5. Muhammad at first observed the Jewish holy day of atonement, but instituted in its place the Ramadan month of fasting. 6. The Jews built their temple on Mount Moriah at Jerusalem. The Muslims built a mosque on the same site, even though there were other places it could have been built, and they had multitudes of mosques elsewhere in the world. 7. Jesus ascended to heaven from the Mount of Olives at Jerusalem. As his death approached, Muhammad had a dream of himself being carried up to heaven from Jerusalem, but Muslims later claimed it actually happened. 8. Moses received the 10 Commandments at Sinai, written by God on tablets of stone. Muhammad claimed that the revelations he received were written from eternity on a tablet in heaven and were brought down to him by the angel Gabriel. Incidentally, Joseph Smith, founder of Mormonism, went a stage further, claimed to have received revelation from God on gold plates sent by an angel from heaven, which got written down in the Book of Mormon, which is very similar size to the Quran. 9. Israel practiced circumcision, so do the Muslims. 10. In the laws given to Moses, the Jews were told to abstain from eating certain foods. The Muslim law follows closely the Mosaic law, which forbids the eating of swine's flesh and other kinds of meats. 11. Jewish law required Saturday to be a sacred day. Muhammad imitated this initially, but changed the day to Friday and made it the same kind of sacred day. 12. Abraham was asked by God to offer his son Isaac as a sacrifice on Mount Moriah. Muhammad changed this and claimed it was his ancestor Ishmael, not Isaac, who God told to offer. 13. God gave Israel the scriptures. Muslims claim that God has given them the scriptures, Muhammad's writings. But God said to Israel, I've declared my word to Israel, and I've not done so with any other nation. God chose the Israelites, not the Ishmaelites, to be the recipients and the custodians of his word. Galatians chapter 4 teaches that it was to be through Isaac's line, not Ishmael's, that the nations were to be blessed. God's purpose of redemption was to be through Abraham's wife, Sarah, and her son, not the Egyptian slave girl, Hagar, and her son. 14. In Mecca, the holy city of Islam, is a cubical building called the Kaaba, which means cube. It's known as the house of Allah, and because of it, all Muslims face Mecca when they pray. This is an imitation of the Jewish religion, whose tabernacle and temple had a holy place inside it. It was all known as the house of Yahweh, and this room was also a cube, a cubical room. And it's hardly a coincidence that the size of Islam's cubical structure is very similar to Israel's. The base of Israel's was 10 by 10 meters, that is 35 by 35 feet. Differing measurements are given for the base of Islam's holy place. Some say it was 10 by 10, others give measurements ranging from 10 by 12. So you see, whichever way, it's very similar size to Israel's holy place. However, the Islam made theirs higher, probably to outdo the Jewish one. Now, during the occupation of the Promised Land by the Mohammedans and the Ottoman Turks, there were small pockets of Jews living in the land, but Jewish immigration was retarded by the occupying Gentile powers. However, over a long period of time, since the Romans destroyed the nation of Israel and expelled the Jews, the Arabs have drifted in from surrounding Arab countries, settled in the land, and they increased in numbers, exceeding the Jews. They built houses, they developed properties, they developed their businesses, and they were there for centuries. So long, in fact, they naturally came to believe that they owned it, that they owned the land. They didn't know, or maybe didn't want to believe, that that land had been given by God to Israel, and that it was God's purpose to bring them back into their land and make them a nation again. The Jews were in exile for so long, I suppose you can understand in a way that it would have been hard to believe that they were ever going to come back again. Failure on Mohammed's and Islam's part to believe and accept the prophecies concerning the return of the Jews to their homeland, and failure to include these prophecies in the Quran so that the Muslims could be taught about them and know about them, that has led to ignorance. Ignorance of God's purpose with the Jews, and this is what has led to all the conflict and the wars and the divisions, and will of course ultimately lead to Armageddon. So we have the situation of Arabs moving in, occupying Israel's land and believing they own it and that Israel's stolen it off them, when in actual fact the opposite is the case. They have stolen it off Israel. I want you to consider this for a moment. Just imagine how you would feel if you owned a property, say a farm, and this farm is called Israel, and some terrorists force you out of it. They exile you to another country where you remain in exile for a long time. Moreover, because these terrorists don't like you, they change the name of your property from Israel to Palestine, hoping to erase all connection with you and hoping you'll never return. In the meantime, some Arab neighbours, seeing that your property has become vacant, they decide to move in, build their houses, build their businesses, etc., and they settle in to stay. And because your property has been renamed Palestine, these Arab neighbours start being called Palestinians on your land, which is actually Israel. They're starting to be called Palestinians. But in reality, they're Arabs, Jordanian Arabs, Egyptian Arabs, Arabian Arabs, etc. They belong actually to Arab countries, which have their own lands. They've got their own capital cities. They've got their own governments, their own laws. They've got their own religion. They've got their own mosques. So eventually, you get released from exile, and naturally, you return to your property. Those who have moved in, they've got no title deeds to the property. They've not made any effort to officially and formally secure ownership in order to have complete sovereignty and control over it. Oh no, but when you return and put your roots back down again, and the authorities recognise and acknowledge your rightful claim to your property, then and only then do these neighbours who have moved in and taken over decide to make an effort to get the authorities to give them jurisdiction of the land, or some of the land, and complete power and sovereignty and control over it, to make it their independent state. I mean, how bizarre. How bizarre that would be if that happened to you. If you had a property and that happened to you. In all land deals, if you've got the title deeds to a property, no one can just move in onto your property and expect the authorities to give them title deeds to your land or any portion of your land. And Israel clearly has the title deeds to this land, given to them by God, recorded many places in the Word of God, and confirmed by history and by archaeology. The Palestinians got nothing, no such authority at ever, no title deeds at all, no historical, no archaeological evidence that they ever occupied the land prior to the Jews being exiled by the Romans. But in spite of this, dividing the land into two states, which has been attempted, one Jewish, the other Arab, has been recommended a number of times. I understand about 6 times altogether it's been recommended that the land be divided into 2 states, an Arab and a Jewish state. And believe it or not, the Jews were willing to accept the proposals. It's their land, but they were willing to accept the proposals and share the land, but the Arabs weren't. Oh no, they didn't want to share what was Israel's land anyway. They didn't want to share the land with Israel, and they declared war against Israel, hoping to wipe them out and destroy the nation. But they were fighting against God, not Israel, because God clearly prophesied He would gather the Jews back to the land and make one nation in the land. Not two. God prophesied there would be one nation. So the failure of 2 is not surprising. We read this in Ezekiel 37. Thus says the Lord God, behold, I will take the people of Israel from the nations among which they have gone, and will gather them from all directions and bring them back to their own land. And I will make them one nation in the land upon the mountains of Israel. And the prophecy goes on to say, this will ultimately lead to a king reigning over them, referring, of course, to their Messiah, which we know and believe is Jesus. As you can imagine, in the event of someone uninvited moving in and trying to take over someone else's property while they are absent, and then claiming that they own it, and then actually attack the owners when they come back to repossess it, well, it's not hard to understand the major problems. It's not difficult. It's inevitable that there are going to be those kind of problems that we've been witnessing over the last few decades. It would be a serious criminal offence for anybody to try and do that to your land or to my land. And it's created hugely complex problems. Some of the methods, though, adopted by the Israelis to lay claim to their land have, I must admit personally, been provocative and unjustified. But some of the methods adopted by the Palestinians to lay claim to the land have also been provocative and unjustified. There have been faults on both sides, but many Israelis would happily live peacefully side by side with the Palestinians, and I know many Palestinians would happily live peacefully side by side with the Israelis. Unfortunately, it's extremists on both sides who have made it very, very difficult. For example, Palestinian suicide bombers. There was a period there where Palestinians were coming in to Israel with bombs hidden, wrapped around them, going into buses, going into restaurants, going down to the marketplaces and just blowing themselves up in front of all the innocent Israeli civilians and causing absolute destruction and havoc. Now, what are you going to do? What are you going to do about that kind of situation? Are you going to just sit back and think, oh, well, it's just something we've got to accept and we've got to put up with it? No. Israel did what was reasonable to do. They put a wall up. They put a wall up and separated that Palestinian area from their own area to control these terrorists who were coming in, bombing innocent Israeli civilians. And so what are the Israeli critics saying today because of it? Oh, it's an apartheid state. It's an apartheid state. Look, they put walls up and they separate people and blah, blah, blah. You know? Well, I'll tell you what, if the boot was on the other foot, I'll guarantee the Palestinians would have done exactly the same. They'd have put a wall up too, if they could afford it, and keep those kind of people and those kind of people out. I know we're at a situation at the moment with the crisis there in Israel. Very difficult, very difficult. I mean, it's what those Palestinian terrorists are is the last straw. It is the last straw. Israel knows if they don't deal with these terrorists, this is just going to be history repeating itself year after year after year. These terrorists are not going to stop. They're animals. They're going to carry on doing this sort of stuff, killing, massacring innocent civilians. And so what Israel has decided to do is Israel has decided to eliminate them, to get rid of them, just dispense with them. And unfortunately, it is so difficult because you've got a lot of innocent civilian people living where these terrorists have burrowed tunnels like rats throughout their territory, where they hide all their weapons and all the rest of it, and so they get affected. It's a bit like when Japan declared war against America, and America could see if they're going to send their land forces into Japan that they're going to have huge losses of armies. So what they do? They nuke them. They dropped a nuclear weapon on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Unfortunately, it affected innocent people. But it saved a lot of lives too. It probably saved more lives than what it actually destroyed. Hitler, with the Hitler mentality, you know, if the American and the British hadn't sent their planes over and bombed hell out of Hamburg and those places where innocent people suffered, innocent people died. But Hitler, he had to be got rid of. You had to get rid of him. It's like a cancer. You can't just let it remain. And that is the difficult situation. Really, really difficult situation. I can understand the Palestinians and the worldwide Palestinians getting all up in arms and heated and upset about what's happening to their innocent civilians. I understand that, and I sympathise that, and I wish I could stop that. But I also understand Israel's position. They have got to deal with this Hamas terrorists, and if they don't, this problem is just going to be an ongoing and continuing problem. Unfortunately, Bible prophecy declares that in the end time, a very powerful confederacy of anti-Israel nations is going to invade the land, and they're going to inaugurate a tribulation unprecedented in history. But the prophecies, and there are many of them, say that this is the time that the Lord Jesus Christ will return. And he will deal once and for all, not just with anti-Semitism, but with anti-Godism and every other anti-thing that's on this planet as a disrupting and destroying influence. And Jesus is going to deal with these problems once and for all. Only he can do it. Only he has the power to do that. And he will establish a worldwide kingdom over which he and his saints will have total control. Then, and only then, there is going to be righteousness and peace in the land. Even more importantly, though, when he returns, he's going to raise the dead. He's going to give eternal life to all who have believed in him, who've been baptized into him, all who have faithfully served him, Palestinians and Jews included. We have booklets and videos on our website which deal more deeply with these subjects, and we invite anybody who listens to this to feel free to download them.